Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles talk show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a program in which we talk about anything that has to do with the Beatles, their past, the present, anything that we feel like talking about. I'm one of the four regular co-hosts of the show. I'm Ken Michaels. You might know me for another Beatles program that I host, a syndicated show called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my three other co-hosts. The man who writes for Beatles Examiner, the number one Beatles news source on the internet, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And we also have one of the writers, one of the main writers for Beatle Fan Magazine. He's been with them since the very beginning, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And also joining us is another writer for Beatle Fan and a freelance writer and musicologist, and writer of several Beatle books. And his latest book was called Got That Something, How I Want It, Hold Your Hand, Changed Everything. That being Allan Kozinn. Hi, Allan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And with us on the show this time is a special guest, someone whose work I'm very familiar with because I've used it quite a lot. One of his a reference book on the solo Beatles called 8 Arms to Hold You. He's one of the co-authors of that book, and he has just finished part one of a 3-volume series on John Lennon's life with Yoko. It's called Lennonology, and the first chapter is called Strange Days Indeed, and that is Chip Madinger. We welcome him to Things We Said Today. Hi, Chip.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me here.
It's great to have you, finally. You know, I've wanted to have you as a guest for quite a long time for 8 Arms to Hold You, and now we have another book to talk about with you. I thought I'd start the conversation by just asking the very basic question of what was the premise behind Lennonology, and what makes this book different from all the other books on John and Yoko.
Well, the premise was when 8 Arms to Hold You, the solo book that you referenced, came out this time of year, Halloween of 2000, I started taking notes for an updated edition. And I made a list of, if I had unlimited time, all the people I'd want to interview to really beef up the book. And I never got past John. There were just so many people to talk to, and you talk to one person and they'd suggest that you talk to two more, and it just kept mushrooming. And then I realized how much Yoko contributed to his art and how much he contributed to hers, and that by only telling John's side of the story, you were really only getting half. Right. There are a lot of things that I learned that I was surprised to find that John had produced in the avant-garde world. So, and the second half of the question was, how is this different? As you all know, there could be libraries filled with Beatle books, and there are. This book has basically been started from scratch. I tried to clear the plate and start with contemporary newspaper interviews and interview sources and build the timeline from that, and then use interviews with contemporaries basically for color. So the main goal of the book was for it to be a very sturdy foundation or timeline of John and Yoko's life together, and then we could hang everybody else's anecdote on this timeline.
Mm-hmm. And just so everyone knows, because this is a 3-volume series, where does this book start, part one, and where does it end? And when can we expect the next 2 volumes?
Well, Strange Days Indeed is presented in a timeline form without foresight. It's like a diary, and it begins with the night that John met Yoko at the Indica Gallery, and it proceeds and goes through December 1980. Volume 1 is basically the setting up for the latter volumes, which will go into considerable depth on the home recordings, the films, the live performances, the happenings, the art gallery exhibitions, and most importantly, the recordings and the music. I hope to strike while the iron is hot and these books, the second and third volumes, I was writing all along, and would hope that around this time next year I could have volume 2. But then again, I said 13 years ago that Strange Days Indeed would be out, and here I am 15 years into a 2-year project. But it's done.
Okay. Well, I'm enjoying what I'm reading so far, and we're going to go around and have each of the hosts ask you a question. So we'll start with Allan.
Okay, so I guess we should clarify for the reader that since the books are sort of in the mail and on the way at this point, we've read basically the first 80 pages. And I guess we can see from that what the format is, how it's laid out, and what kind of things are in it. When you say without foresight, you're sort of talking about like in the same way that Mark Lewison wrote his book without, the wisdom of hindsight of knowing what eventually happened, right? So when you talk about, for instance, John starting to record Good Night, you say in his yet untitled lullaby for Julie, and we all sort of know what it is, but you're not jumping the gun because it hasn't been titled yet, right? That's basically yeah. Is there? I'm not sure what the stuff in the back of the book is going to look like. Are the footnotes sort of like by page number, because there are so many quotes, and sometimes you wonder where they're from?
Okay. Now that we have the benefit of pretty much everybody has a home computer and access to the internet, I've created a separate document that annotates and notes all of the sources for every interview quote. And that is going to be available electronically on the website. It's currently running around 180 pages. So it's basically, May 18th, JL, what I did today, and then it'll say New York Times, May 17th, and it will allow everybody to go back and follow up on the sources if they're so inclined. There will also be an electronic index of names and an electronic index of song titles. So basically, you can print these out a couple pages at a time, or the whole thing, and you can have it side by side with the book, and you're not constantly flipping back and forth like you would be in a traditional book of this sort.
Okay.
Will there be an electronic version of the full book as well?
At this time, I'm concentrating all my efforts on the print version of the future editions so that I can get those out, and then I will take a look into producing an electronic version, because as you all know, once one electronic copy gets out, it tends to get distributed quite freely, and it's with the amount of work involved, I would rather that didn't happen. But a searchable version is definitely beneficial.
Sure. I guess, one of the things that sort of struck me reading it is that you account for John and Yoko's sort of sense of humor and have a sort of wry sense of humor of your own as well. I mean, it was just funny reading, and I ended up reading bits out loud to my wife, Paula, as I was going through them, because, it was sort of like on this day, this is almost certainly the day on which John declared himself to be Jesus Christ, and it's put very straightforwardly, but it's really very funny, and especially the way the whole rest of the paragraph unfolds was kind of amusing.
Well, I tried to make it so that it, like Eight Arms, was enjoyable to read in addition to being used just strictly as a reference.
Right. Yeah.
And the Lennons were some very funny people. We've seen a little bit, but those of us who've had the privilege of hearing a lot of interviews and the like that not the general public hasn't seen or heard, that's even more evident. And I've tried to introduce as much as I can of that into the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it worked so far, in the bits I've seen so far.
Right. With 1968 basically being the preview chapter, it's well-worn territory for other writers, and I think we've turned up a lot of things that are unique or different facets to the story. And I should probably mention at this time that the book was co-authored with Scott Riley. I started it in 2000, and about 5 years into the project, Scott came on. He's another collector and historian, and probably is no stranger to any of you that are on any Beatles forums. And he proved to be an excellent help in the researching and being a devil's advocate and walking through, possible timelines with me when there was a lot of detective work involved in this. What color socks were John wearing in this picture, and was it taken the same day as this picture? And it's a pretty rock solid reference as far as I'm concerned. We looked at it every way and tried to discredit what we'd written, and we made sure that everything worked, and I'm quite happy with how it turned out.
Okay, Steve?
Well, Chip, let me ask a basic question, and I know this gets debated a lot on Beatles forums, and there's a lot of differing opinions from people. And I guess the best way to ask the question is, why does Yoko matter? What did Yoko bring to the relationship? And what was her biggest assets as far as what she brought to John and what she herself had in terms of her artwork and her just her whole thing. I mean, because she was very unique. You have to say that.
I will agree. She was very unique. She was a well-known artist in her own right in the avant-garde circles. I think what she brought to the relationship was that John was able to open himself up and express his art in different mediums. And she served as a great foil for him, a great muse, and likewise for Yoko. John served as her muse in many instances, and their relationship was very tit for tat. Their albums, for example, the singles would come out with a John song on the A side and Yoko on the B side. Their albums would be issued in tandem with the Plastic Ono Band albums, Imagine and Fly, Feeling the Space and Mind Games. They were truly John and Yoko, one word.
Mm-hmm. What would you say, though, as far as, people have, for example, the Live Peace in Toronto album, when you hear that, especially for the first time, and listen to her side of that album, people have been known to go, what is that? How do you explain what she did and what she was doing on her own to where, because I've seen her perform. I saw her at Stanford a couple of years ago, and it was an absolutely astonishing performance. But I think a lot of people look at what she does and don't really understand what she's trying to do. What would you say she's trying?
I think Yoko's biggest thing is total communication. She wants to be able to communicate in all types of medium. And with the live performances, fortunately, we have video footage or film footage of a lot of these performances where we can actually see how she's performing, and you'll probably agree that it comes off a lot better with the visuals than it does just hearing the LP. I think she was just totally free in expressing what she was trying to express at that point in time. And in Live Peace, she was performing Don't Worry Kyoko, which was an older piece from late 1968, and would soon come out as the B-side to the Cold Turkey single. So that was one of the tunes that she played that night, and that was in more of an extended version with, basically using her voice as its own unique instrument. Instead of a lengthy drum solo, we have a solo full of Yoko's vocalizations.
Mm-hmm. Would you also agree that one of the elements of their relationship was the fact that they both looked at each other as equals? They were on equal footing. It wasn't obviously it wasn't like the Cynthia John relationship, but they were definitely, toe to toe, definitely equal standing between the two. Is that what you?
Yes, that's exactly it. John treated Yoko as an equal. She had a very difficult time living in his shadow and making herself heard, and possibly that contributed to some of the intensity of her performances. Was to actually to come across as something memorable. But John would treat her as he often used the expression that you wouldn't ask your best friend to go get you a cup of coffee or something like that. If I were to ask Paul that, well, he'd hit me. So he put Yoko on an equal footing, as you put it.
Okay. Thanks, Chip.
Okay. How about you, Al?
Conversely, kind of to play devil's advocate on flipping over from Steve's questioning, you're certainly aware that there is a considerable number of your potential audience who probably resent the fact that that it is John and Yoko, one word, that you're equating the two of them. How do you answer those kind of, how dare you put her on, in the status of a Beatle, that sort of thing? How do you counter those kinds of but I don't want to say accusations, but certainly.
That's a fine word. I
yeah.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I had a guy write today or yesterday that, I'm a big fan of the other work, but how could you include Yoko on give her equal time in this book? That's a deal breaker for me.
Exactly.
And the way I'd have to answer that is I think you'll be very surprised how much you learn about John in reading about Yoko. Obviously, our primary goal here is to learn as much about John and the other Beatles as much as we can, but you can't write her out of the story. She was there for all of it, and she contributed to it, and I think the readers will be pleasantly surprised how much they learn and what they learn about John and his personality and his artistic output by reading about the Yoko-led art endeavors.
Now, for instance, there have been books written about John's humor, but you indicate that actually both of them have a great deal of a sense of humor and of irony. In Yoko's case, how would you explain that?
Yoko's humor was very dry and not often expressed in public, but it's present in the interviews and the recordings that we all amass. I think some of the most interesting examples of John and Yoko's verbal bantering is present on a lot of the hidden mic tapes from the Double Fantasy sessions. And a lot of the dialogue that would go back and forth between them. For example, I think Yoko was trying to record a lead vocal to one of her songs and having difficulty with it. And once she'd finally completed it, John's response was, "Next time, write a song that you can sing." And, I can't, because this is a public broadcast here, to say what her response was, but
I can imagine.
I think we can all imagine. So there was a lot of that present, and in the book kind of turned into an oral history. There was so much interview material available for them that we were able to tell the story in their own words. So I think a lot of the wisecracks and examples of their humor, I tried to leave in to make it as entertaining as possible, to show that side of the Lennons that we don't see as an outsider.
Now, in telling the story in their own words, that sometimes can be difficult in John's case, because a lot of times what he would say in one interview he might totally go the opposite direction in an interview that he did 6 months later.
I don't know that I should read the opening of the book here so that it doesn't spoil it for everybody else, but there's a prime quote from John that kind of addresses your comment. And would you like me to go ahead with that?
Please.
John was poor with dates. He spoke in generalities and frequently exaggerated. On rare occasions, a factual error will be noted by use of the Latin verb sic, and only if warranted so as not to distract from the text or dilute the purpose of the annotation. The reader can be confident that we are aware of these inaccuracies and have deliberately left them in place. In some cases, a comment will contradict what has been presented elsewhere as a fact. One might argue that they were there, but only after careful consideration and diligent research will a distinct contradiction of a direct quote appear in an entry. So John mentioned that I'm not good with dates, but whatever it was, it's all documented. That's why I don't have to bother with dates, because it's all on paper in the file somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think with Strange Days Indeed, we have managed to bring many of those papers together, as many of those as possible, and collate them and present them as what we've subtitled A Scrapbook of Madness, which may be a quote familiar to many of you that have heard the Rolling Stone interview. Mm-hmm. And John had perceived himself in his retirement years as being on the coast of Scotland or Cornwall, where he and Yoko could spend time going through their scrapbook of madness and waiting for postcards from Sean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And,
did that answer that one?
Yeah, no, and then you can pretty much let the audience or your readership pretty much draw their own conclusions.
Exactly.
Right. Ken?
Yeah, I was wondering, I know that so much of the information that you got in the book was from sources of the time. Did you try to approach Yoko while writing this book for an interview yourself, as well as so many of the other key figures in John's life, like the other Beatles, people at Apple, Cynthia Lennon? Did you get any interviews from any of those people?
I don't want to drop any names. Allan was involved in an early stage because he had a relationship with Yoko, and we were trying to decide, should we talk to her or not? And we decided that in order to present an unbiased story, we felt that we should forsake her input and to proceed with that we had sufficient material to tell the story, and we wanted to keep it truthful and unbiased, and I think we were able to achieve that. Granted, she would have been able to bring something to the table, but there may very well have been strings attached, and we wanted to avoid that.
Okay.
A lot of the other major people, we talked to some, none of the Beatles, but I think we had an excellent cross-sampling of the two different camps, the pro-Yoko camp and the anti-Yoko camp, and presented both sides equally to, as you put it, let the reader draw their own conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering about the people at Apple because so many key figures have now passed away, like Neil Aspinall and Derek Taylor. Did you think in any way of approaching them? Did you interview them at all?
Did not interview either of the gentlemen. I did have access to a lot of documentation that from the Apple years that has not been published before, and we were able to use that in the new book, not necessarily as in the form that it appeared, but as a solid foundation for the information that we had gathered.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to ask you just a simple question here, which I think a lot of Beatle fans will question, and that is that it's often said that Yoko didn't really know who the Beatles were at the time when when Yoko met John. Do you believe that to be the case? I mean, she was in the avant-garde world. She could have been pretty much in a vacuum, not being aware of what was going on in pop music at the time. Is there anything to indicate that that wasn't the case?
I came across nothing to, I think Yoko's the only person that could answer that, and whether or not she would answer that completely truthfully, no one will know but Yoko. One thing I will say about a lot of the early time in the book, there wasn't a lot of information on it because, for all intents and purposes, they were having an affair. So that's clearly something that I would think that they would not publicize in any manner. So because we were so reliant on contemporary documentation, there are some holes in those early days of their relationship that only the two of them could have told anybody what happened.
All right. For all that's said about how the press in particular have been unkind to Yoko for so many years, especially around the time of the Beatle breakup and trying to understand the relationship between John and Yoko throughout the 70s and up through John's passing, it's also been said that in particular in England, she was really treated horribly. Was she treated so much worse there than in America? And can you shed some light on that?
I would have to say yes. Being Anglophiles, as I'm sure you all are, you are familiar with how vicious the British press can be. And she was an easy target. And around the time, I'd say July of 71, it had come to a breaking point, and John was so fed up with how they were being treated, he basically said, if it wasn't for this huge house I have here, being Tittenhurst Park, we'd be out of here. And it didn't take too much longer until they landed in New York, and as we all know, didn't come back.
Right.
There are examples throughout the book, many examples of the British press and their reaction to Yoko and their accusations. Those have been left in because they're factual. I mean, they were treated poorly. She was in particular, and John, loving her as much as he did, of course, took it all personally.
Was it more to do with the fact that she was an avant-garde artist and hard to understand? Or was it just because people couldn't understand the relationship between her and John?
I think it was more so the latter, that people could not understand what John saw in Yoko. And, people fear most what they don't understand. And I believe that was the case.
Allan?
Yeah, I think in terms of it is an interesting question that people always think about and debate about whether Yoko knew who the Beatles were or not. But you have in one section of the book, it's either Anthony Fawcett or Pete Shotton is sent off with Yoko to explain to her the sort of roadmap of Beatles world and who's who and all that. And you would think that if she knew that much about it, she wouldn't really need to be told a lot of that, I think. I mean, the little bits of evidence that come through the book about whether or not she knew who the Beatles were really sort of indicate that she may not have, she may have been a little in the dark about that because she did come from a different world.
That's a great observation. I mean, and that's a good example of how when we didn't know a black and white answer to a question such as, did Yoko know who John was, we would leave indications, anecdotes or the like that might shed some light one way or the other, and to let the reader decide then.
And I think also, I mean, it is an interesting question as Al asked about, why couldn't you just focus on John? But I think another thing that will come through the book is that you can't. I mean, you just can't. They were John and Yoko in effect, and you could, as a record buyer, decide to just buy the stuff that John had to himself. But if you're telling the story, it's kind of like telling the story of tying a shoe but not doing the left lace, So Yeah, I mean, I don't imagine there was ever a period while you were at the very beginning when you were starting this when you thought of it possibly as just being John.
Eight Arms to Hold You basically concentrated on John's individual efforts, and as I mentioned, the new book started out as by gathering information as an update to Eight Arms. So I would have to say yes. In the early stages of the book, I did consider, just presenting John's escapades or activities. But then when I realized how much she was involved, I realized that you just can't tell one side of the story. You'll only get half of what he was.
Mm-hmm. I know that the process of writing this was done at the same time as collecting information for the books about the works and how they came together. I think a lot of people, I mean, obviously will get this as a backdrop to the second book, but are really, really waiting for the second book because of all that information that we don't have that we want to read about. And I'm wondering how you sort of juggled the two feats, because they're different kinds of books, but they sort of complement each other.
The book was very carefully designed in that regard, so as to provide a background, a guidepost, as it were, to the activities and the recordings and the like. But in order to keep the work consistent, in some cases, we know a lot more about the recording of the Imagine album than we would about the Fly album. But in this book, in order to keep it consistent, we would just include, the basic recording sessions. This day they worked on Crippled Inside. And in the future books, that'll be detailed to the nth degree. We'll have the take numbers, we'll have the tape box numbers, we'll have the remix numbers, and just about everything that you could imagine. So there were guideposts left there, and there was enough information, I think, in Strange Days Indeed to give the reader a lot of new information, but there's a lot to look forward to in the later books.
Mm-hmm. So how much information did you dig up about life with the Lions? You couldn't very well not mention it on a show about John and Yoko.
No, we could.
It's more a little running joke.
We know when they did side one, and of course, and actually, it's kind of neat that side one was just an excerpt of a all afternoon concert where different musicians would wander onto the stage and contribute their part of the performance, and the extract that we have as Cambridge 1969 was just John and Yoko's contribution to that natural music concert at the Lady Mitchell Hall. So there's plenty about life with the Lions, Allan. More than you know.
Are there outtakes?
Yes. And not going to go to this. Yeah, there are outtakes of 2 minute silence. No, there are a few, there are some additional bits that haven't been documented before.
Oh my God! Now you got Allan all excited.
Well, where did you? What about the story? The famous story of the rat. Where did you end up on that one? Did people know this? Apparently, the reports were by people who were there, although Yoko has denied it, that at one point they brought in a shoebox with a dead rat in it, and they spent a lot of time discussing how to mic the dead rat.
Really?
Yeah. Yoko later claimed that it never happened, but several people who were there say that it did. So how did you navigate your way through that, Chip?
I asked a number of people if they remembered the event. Nobody would fess up. I did find a possibility of where the story may have originated was when she was recording the Fly album. They were considering doing some recording with another avant-garde artist, Henry Flint. And there were some sessions produced at the same time by Al Steckler of Apple. And I don't have the exact titles in front of me, but one of them was, I think, Giant Rat and Dead Spiders. So it's quite possible that the urban legend has grown out of the notation on a tape box.
Interesting. I suppose we can kick this over to Al to bring it up to a more civil level at this point.
Well, most people know you primarily through Eight Arms to Hold You, which, to put it in a capsule form, basically chronicles just about every professional move that the Beatles made right up to roughly 2000. Now, with that background, how would you then explain basically what is different besides the Yoko factor? What is different about this project as opposed to Eight Arms to Hold You, and particularly in the case of the large amount of material on John, which is in Eight Arms to Hold You?
I would see Strange Days Indeed as more of a history book, whereas Eight Arms to Hold You is a collector's guide.
Right.
Heavily annotated collector's guide, whereas Strange Days Indeed gives you the background, gives you the historical foundation. The future volumes of the Lennonology series are going to be more of the collector's guide.
In what way?
They'll be similar to the presentation in Eight Arms to Hold You. There'll be a song-by-song analysis, only in this case with considerably more information about the sessions and the other artistic endeavors, the films. I think one of the most satisfying parts of researching the books was working on locating the various film locations in New York City, where they shot a lot of the little silent bits for the Imagine film.
Sure.
So there's a lot of new information on that. I was particularly excited when we located where the large orange plexiglass circles were that featured so much in the film and promotional photos used by Apple. That was a piece of information that I was reluctant to publish the book until we found it.
Without giving too much away, where were they?
They're in New York City. I'm not a native New Yorker, but I want to say Lake Street. But they were down on the southern tip of Manhattan. They spent the day and hit maybe a half a dozen sites down around on the southern tip of Manhattan, and I believe that's where they started that day. Water Street, there it is, 77 Water Street. Yeah, Water Street Plaza, as we say here in the Midwest, out on the plaza.
The plaza, right?
Yeah. And I believe they are still there, looking as orange as ever.
Really? All these years later? That's very interesting. Very interesting. Steve?
We all live for bits like that. That's right.
Sure.
That's right. Chip, let me ask you a question. Well, let me ask you a couple of things. Number one, do you have any theory on, because we all know what they were doing the night when John was killed, do you have any theory on where their music would have been headed had he not been killed?
I can only speculate, of course. I think they would have finished off the second album, whether or not they would have used all the material that appeared on Milk and Honey or not. I think he probably would have come up with some more material for the second record. And I do believe that the wheels were starting to turn to plan a small concert tour. So I think there would have been live performances in the spring, summer of 1981.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said, I think Yoko has actually confirmed that. In fact, I think it was, I remember writing a while back that he was actually talking about doing Beatles songs for that. Let me ask one other thing, kind of an unrelated thing, and I don't know if this is too sticky to get into or not, but it's always kind of been my feeling, sad to say, that a lot of the dislike of Yoko has been a racial thing. Do you have any theories about that? Do you agree with that?
When I was writing the book, I was surprised, and I won't say shocked, but I was surprised to read a quote that John considered them to be a biracial couple, and I had never thought of them that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't say for certain, but I don't know that a lot of the negative publicity or feelings toward Yoko would have stemmed from that.
Mm-hmm. And not necessarily from that comment, because that's the first time I'd heard that. But I'm just, I remember, for example, and this has nothing to do with anything, when Cynthia Lennon appeared at the Fest for Beatle fans in Los Angeles and mentioned her name, there were a lot of boos. And now that may have been more for Cynthia, loyalty to Cynthia than anything else. But I do remember that. And there's anytime it seems like you bring up Yoko's name, there are always people that will have negative comments. I think I put up a link or something the other day, and there were people, complaining about it. And it's just, it's strange that, her art is, we were talking earlier, her art is unique. It's just, you wonder how much, if people are judging it partially from that angle. I mean, you hope not, for God's sake. But
you hope not. Clearly, she's undeserving of all of the negative feelings towards her. I just think she's such an easy target because, people suggest that she broke up the Beatles, and
right.
It works itself into, it hits the internet, and everybody that really doesn't know the background of the breakup of the Beatles just latch onto that fact.
And that's still prevalent. I mean, you can still see it. I mean, how many times have you seen the headline, oh no, every time, it gets used all the time, because of her, every time they want to mention her, and it's pretty disgusting. It's just,
I think John has mentioned in an interview or two that he thought that it was racist early on.
Did he?
Possibly even in the Rolling Stone interview. He made it clear that he felt that a lot of especially the British press, treatment of her was racist. But that was how he felt it, and wouldn't surprise me if there was some of that. Although it's funny, one of the things that Chip quotes from the Daily Mail, where John turns up with Yoko and they identify her as Bottom's girl.
Wow. But one of the charm, if
you go, Allan.
If there's a real charm about her, though, it's that she has a very childlike attitude. That's one thing that really kind of makes her. I mean, even now, especially nowadays, if you see her, a video of her talking or just her, some of her writing, it's very innocent, and it's very, it's very interesting to see that she is that way. And I think that's part of the reason, that she should be liked for that reason. I know that that's not going to win over everybody, but
I'd agree. I don't know how much of it is an act.
That's a good point.
How much of it is put on to maintain that image, but you'd think her artwork is simplistic, but I think there is some complexity to it in that she has designed it so that the participant has to contribute to the piece of art to make it whole.
That's a great point. It's a great point.
That all of their early efforts were termed unfinished music because they wanted the listener to have their contribution to it. And as I think we said in 8 Arms to Hold You, many listeners' contribution was to turn off the turntable.
Well, she still does that with the Wish Tree and all that, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's still very true. Ken?
It just suddenly struck me that we live very much in an interactive world these days. And so much of what Yoko brought in her artwork was just that. So I think in some ways she was very much ahead of her time in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you agree, Chip?
Yes, I would. I think it might have been in 1995 or 96 in the early days of the internet. She had a daily piece called Acorns. Is that right, Allan? Does that ring a bell? Where every day she'd send out an email or send out an instruction that basically goes back to one of her very early pieces, the Do-It-Yourself Dance Festival, which is when she would send out a postcard with an instruction on it. And this was in the early stages of her relationship with John. And he said in many interviews that at times he'd be elated with the instructions that she'd sent. And at other times he'd find them terribly frustrating. And that's one of the things I do enjoy about her work is the unfinished aspect of it.
All right, you sort of hinted on this earlier, but could you just pinpoint, without giving too much away, just give an example of something that you learned about John and or Yoko in doing your research that you never knew before that really surprised you? Maybe one or two examples.
Okay, let me think. I should have been prepared for a question like that. I think a lot of the things where we were able to conclusively pinpoint when certain events happened, such as we can say conclusively the night that they did meet. We can say conclusively the night that they created Two Virgins at Kenwood, which is considerably different date than has been widely accepted in the past. So there's a lot of new information in that regard. Something I learned about them, wow, there's just so much that is new in the book.
Is there a song or a project that you discover that maybe has never been reported before?
I got one for you here. We were able to, it's long been rumored that the Plastic Ono Band recorded an instrumental called Rock Piece. Many might have heard about that, and due to a mention in the Beatles book, and we were able to determine the recording date and the recording personnel for the piece, and have also found a copy of the Rock Piece recording. And I think when we do reveal that, people will be very, very surprised.
Well, so is it discussed in this volume?
Nope. I give the recording date and the people, but I don't tell where you can find it.
Oh, okay.
You gotta keep something to keep you reading the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
But there are a lot of little things like that throughout that are, little markers to something that's going to be coming in the future, or a little setup to a topic that's going to be covered in more detail. And like I said, a lot of that was to maintain consistency through the new book, since we know a lot more about Imagine than we do about Life with the Lions. One thing we were unable to determine conclusively were the recordings that were the 78 recordings that they incorporated on the Two Virgins album. We feel that it was a record out of John's collection, but we've been unable to find the actual recording.
Is there any information on the songs that John wrote in the late 70s that were supposed to be used for a musical called The Ballad of John and Yoko?
Since this book is so date sensitive, as it were, so timeline based, a lot of John's private recordings weren't documented in that regard. So what I've done here is included a list. I think it's a 3 or 4 page list of unreleased song titles that were recorded during that house husband period.
Right.
And I'll go into the stage musical aspects in one of the future books.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask you this one very important question, since I'm a major fan of Eight Arms to Hold You, as are all of us. Are there any plans that you would ever update and include all the other solo works from the other Beatles up to the present time?
Are you crazy? Do you think I could ever listen to all those McCartney or Ringo shows over again? Oh, I would. I don't think that's going to be possible just because of the. I think Ringo's past 750 live shows now with the All-Star Band, something like that.
But you have all the studio albums to go through.
We have a lot of new George information. I have a lot of new Ringo information, a lot of Paul information. But there's still some big gaps that would make the book very lopsided or inconsistent. You know, you could have a lot of information about, for example, the recording of All Things Must Pass and the mixing of the album, but absolutely nothing about the George Harrison album except a 2 or 3 month period when the songs were done, just because that album was recorded at home and the information hasn't made it into the public eye because there haven't been members of the public involved in the production. So that's one reason I'd be reluctant to produce an updated version of Eight Arms. I could possibly see maybe an updated version that covers the same period up through 2000, which would be a case of something's better than nothing, I suppose. And there would be just reams of new information that could be included in that, but it's finding a good vehicle for it. I was just going to say the answer that at this point, with what I've gone through in the last few months and completing and getting Strange Days Indeed printed, is I don't want to work on any Beatle books for a little bit.
I'll bet.
That might change by next week, but I think I'm going to take the rest of the week off.
Well, you've earned it there.
Yeah.
Yes, it's 15 years in the making. I don't know where the time's gone, but I often thought that one morning I'd wake up and it would just be done, and it almost came to that. You know, just kept filling in the gaps and finding more and more pieces, and eventually it was all there and just needed to be strung together.
Mm-hmm. Now, this first volume is also a limited edition, correct? There's only a limited number of copies.
Right now, there is a limited number of hardback copies. There were 500 hardback copies produced. The first 250 were numbered and signed by Scott and myself. And then the first run of the paperback edition was around 1,500 copies. Okay. So they are just starting to ship out now. People are receiving the first copies today. So I'm kind of anxious to see what the reaction is after all this time. And the books are selling well without anybody having read a single page yet.
All right. So do you guys have any last questions for Chip?
How do people get it? I don't think did we actually ask that? I don't think we did.
Give your website.
Yes.
No, that's a good thing to mention here. I'd forgotten all about it. The book is available exclusively at the website www.lennonology.com. You will not find it on Amazon. You will not find it in your local bookstore. So if you want a copy, that's where you need to go.
Okay. Anybody else?
Nope.
All right. So if you would like to get in touch with us, we have an email address here for the show, which is thingswesaidtoday.radioshow@gmail.com. We also have our own Facebook page, and we have our own Twitter account. What's the address there, Steve?
It's Things We Said Fab.
Right. And if you want to get in touch with me, Ken Michaels, you can do so at my email address, which is everylittlething@att.net. And be sure to check out my website, kenmichaelsradio.com. Al, if people want to get in touch with you, they can do so how?
Basically either through Facebook or BeatleFan, www.beatlefan.com, or Facebook at Al Sussman, or on Twitter at ASUSS49. And also, I guess, through Parading Press as well.
All right. How about you, Allan?
Oh, probably the easiest way to get in touch with me is through Facebook, either under Allan Kozin or my alter ego, Allan Kozin Remixed. Or you could email me at allankozin@gmail.com.
Steve, how about you?
People can get in touch with me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I also have my own Facebook page, and there's a Beatles news group where I post things all the time, Beatles news and commentary that you're welcome to join.
Okay. And Chip, it's been great having you here. We'd love to have you on again. Keep us posted when the next volume will come out, and good luck with the first volume.
Thanks again, guys.
All right, so for Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, Allan Kozin, and Chip Madinger, I'm Ken Michaels saying thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.